Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to discuss about the optimal use of Ceramis. I would like to give you guys some ideas and some observations that I've discovered along the way, because many of you are starting to ask me about the pots with Ceramis, what type of mixes should you use for a particular species and so on. So I'll try to cover all these subjects into one big video and tell you everything that I've observed with Ceramis. Okay, so there are three major things that will affect the performance of Ceramis and of your orchid. First big thing is the pot you are using. Second, the type of orchid you are growing in Ceramis. And third of all, the environment. So I'll take them one by one and elaborate. First of all, the pot you are using. Now, when I started my setup, I only had the theoretical side of things. I didn't have the practical side of things. But luckily I got it right, and I have to say that Ceramis works best with clay pots, unglazed pots. You don't need ventilation holes. It has to be a clay pot without glaze. Now, the reason why I say this is that clay pots are porous, and when I say porous, the entirety of the pot is porous. Imagine this is a material that is already porous, made in a certain shape. So no matter the level, no matter the position of a place you are picking on your pot, it will have pores, it will be ventilated. With plastic pots, I have to say it is the worst choice that I would use. I tried it with a Phalaenopsis. I tried to mix the Ceramis in a certain way. I absolutely hated it, even with the ventilation hose. Because if you can imagine, a plastic pot will be ventilated only where you drill the ventilation holes. So if you drill them like I used to on the sides like this, practically making some sort of slits, you will still have segments that are not ventilated. So either you put holes everywhere, which is kind of unsightly and I don't know, maybe too much work, either you reevaluate your choice. Now, this doesn't mean that plastic pots cannot be used with Ceramis and leca and all of that. I think it is doable, but with a lot of hassle. And if you compare the evolution of an orchid or how it behaves in a clay pot next to a plastic pot, it is like night and day difference. I cannot even bear the thought of keeping my orchids in plastic and Ceramis. It simply doesn't go. Also, no matter how much I mix it with leca, it stays too moist for my liking and for my environment. Can you believe that? So overall, I absolutely hated how Ceramis did in a plastic pot. And my plastic pot was not super big, it was 13 centimeters. Given it wasn't a big pot, but it was enough to keep the Ceramis too moist. Now, glazed clay pots will perform exactly like plastic pots, maybe even worse if they don't have slits, because the glaze on top of the clay pot blocks the pores, so you will not have any type of ventilation. It will be exactly the same thing as a plastic pot. And I know there are those glazed pots which have little slits. I really don't know how good it will perform. Depends how big the slits are, because as I was saying, you don't have equal ventilation all over the place. And in the case of the Ceramis, it's really not like bark chips. So even though gravity pulls down on the water and it will try to keep more moisture on the bottom than on the top, Ceramis is too absorbent for that. It will actually try to stay evenly moist. So in the end, it's not going to work like you expect it to work. So I don't think glazed pots are a good alternative as well. Doesn't mean it will not work. You can make it work, of course, but it's really not optimal, and it's more of a hassle than anything else, and you're better off using bark or sphagnum moss than Ceramis. Okay, so we covered the type of pot which is optimal. Let's talk about the size of the pot. All of the sizes are optimal, there's no issue with that, but you have to keep in mind some certain features. Now, as I've discovered, very tiny pots like the ones I have there, I think they're 8 centimeter pots, they will do perfect only with Ceramis, pretty much no matter the orchid, because they will dry out no matter what you do very fast. The bigger you go in size, the more leca I think you should mix in, again, no matter the orchid. The tricky part comes with the medium sizes, so 11 centimeters in my case and 13 centimeters are pretty tricky, and you need to kind of play around with the ratio of the Ceramis and leca just to make it optimal. And by the way, I'll link you down below to the converter between inch and centimeters. I'm not good at it, so I don't want to say something stupid, but of course you can convert the measurements that I say into inches if you're living in the United States or a country that uses inches, not centimeters or meters. So for me, the tricky pots are the 11 and 13 centimeters. This is where the type of orchid actually comes in. Everything above 13 centimeters, like a 15 centimeter, it will most probably be better with a mix of leca and Ceramis. No matter how much water-loving your orchid is, it's too much. It's too much of a big pot. It might stay way too moist. And maybe for the vast majority of orchids, it's not okay. But not only the moisture counts here, but the ventilation as well, because you do have pores in the clay pot. But if it's too big, the middle of the pot will have less ventilation. So the smaller the pot is, the more ventilated it is. The bigger it is, you have to help it a little bit because it's just the nature of things. It's too big to be super ventilated. And if you only put Ceramis, which will be very moist, that might clog up the air pockets that Ceramis holds, and it's not gonna be good. So everything below 11 centimeters can go full Ceramis, pretty much no matter the orchid and pretty much no matter the granulation of Ceramis. Everything above 13 centimeters, you need to have a mix just to be on the safe side, and it's of course a lot more manageable. Okay, the type of orchid you have. This is important too, not as important as the type of pot and its size actually. So of course, if you have those orchids that like a lot of ventilation, it is a good idea to use a mixture between Ceramis and leca. You don't have to make a 50-50 mixture or anything of the sorts, but just have some leca to help with the ventilation. It really does help. So things like Callias, for me, they all have a mixture of leca and Ceramis, both in the 11 centimeter pots and also the 13 centimeter pots, and of course above is a given. I always mix it. Anything that sits in a 15 centimeter pot and above has a mixture, does not have only Ceramis. And from this you can extrapolate. Everything that has very thick roots will do better in a mixture, will appreciate more ventilation as a general rule, and everything that is very fine rooted and actually appreciates more moisture, such as Oncidiums and Miltonias, Miltoniopsis of course, intergenerics, things of the sorts, they will pretty much have more Ceramis added in the mix. Even in 11 centimeter pots, I will only use Ceramis. In 13 centimeter pots, I can use only Ceramis, but the big chunks, not the small chunks, and of course depends on the size of the orchid. But with these two sizes, you are okay with a mixture of leca. Just keep in mind the type of orchid. If it's a Cattleya, a little bit more leca. Not 50-50. 50-50 is too much in 11 or 13 centimeter pots, but maybe 30% leca, it's always welcomed. And with Oncidiums, again in 11 centimeter pots, you don't have to put any leca pretty much, but bigger chunked Ceramis is a little bit better, a little bit more manageable, dries better. And if you do want to use a little bit of leca, just go for I don't know, 20% leca and the rest Ceramis, big chunk Ceramis, and everything should be okay. Keep in mind, even for Oncidiums, Brassias, and all of that, if you go over 13 centimeter pots, you should use some leca definitely. Okay, Phalaenopsis, most of them are sitting in 15 centimeter pots. Phalaenopsis are top heavy, they're big. I immediately went for the 15 centimeter pots. I think I only have one Phalaenopsis in 13 centimeters or two. And the reason why they are in the 13th is because I was not sure about their evolution. But basically I go for the 15th, and as I was saying, 15 centimeter pots equals a mixture of leca and Ceramis. And of course, Phalaenopsis have very chunky roots, very thick roots. They will appreciate the airiness. So for Phalaenopsis, I will definitely go for a mix between leca and Ceramis. 30% leca if you want some percentages. I never work with them, but you know, if they help you, 30% leca and the rest big chunk Ceramis. Not the small chunk, big chunk. But there are also mini Phalaenopsis. The minis are potted in 11 centimeter pots, and that seems to do pretty well for them. And I use again a mixture of leca and Ceramis, quite a lot less leca than Ceramis of course, and I'm always using the big chunk Ceramis. For Phalaenopsis, I don't think I would use the smaller Ceramis because it simply doesn't hold enough air pockets, as I believe Phalaenopsis would prefer. And my phals are really doing great in this combination. This is what I would advise and I would use. So pretty much it's a game of the actual orchid you have, its preferences, if it likes to stay moist, and also the size of the pot. You need to think of all of these things at the same time. So I have a, what is this? I think it's a 10 centimeter pot, this one, it's not 11. And I have small Ceramis in it because I do have a fine-rooted orchid, water-loving orchid. Here I have a Phalaenopsis keiki in an 8 centimeter pot. You can see I did use only Ceramis in this one, but it's the bigger chunk. Even if it's a small pot, I didn't use the small Ceramis because I'm dealing with a Phalaenopsis. Here I have a mixture, of course, of things, even though I do have a water-loving orchid, because this pot is very wide. I do want to maintain that aeration in the center of the pot, and I cannot do it only with Ceramis. And here I have another small pot with an aerangus. As you can see, I have the big Ceramis, even though it is a small pot, because this orchid really appreciates ventilation. This orchid does very well mounted. That should give you an idea of its preferences. So I am adapting, but no leca in this pot. Here I have an 11 centimeter pot, again with an aerangus. No leca in this pot, only big chunk Ceramis. Again, keeping in accordance to the size of the pot and the preference of my orchid. and so on. This is the tricky part with the 11 centimeter pots and the 13 centimeter pots, and you really do need to know the requirements of your orchid and as much information as you can gather about your orchid. And when it comes to the bigger pots, it doesn't matter quite at all the species of orchids. You need a lot of ventilation in these pots. They're simply too big, and I would suggest that you do go for a leca and Ceramis mix. Never more leca than Ceramis actually, but a 20 or 30% leca will always be helpful. Okay, and the third aspect, climate. Now, the Ceramis will do perfect in very warm climates, but it's not a rule. It really depends on how you grow your orchids. So for example, you live in a cold climate, but you are growing your orchids in your house, you use heaters, the air is dry. Ceramis is perfect for you, really. The drier and warmer the air, the better. The cooler and more humid the air, that's when things get a little bit tricky and you can start having some issues. Keep in mind, Ceramis is a very water retentive and absorbent material. That is why I use it in my climate. There are those environments and growing spaces which are humid and cool as a given. So if you have that type of setup, maybe Ceramis is really not for you. Maybe you actually don't need it and you are doing perfectly fine the way you are growing your orchids currently. So the Ceramis mix and all of my setup are designed to work great in very warm environments. Humidity, so and so. I have high humidity, it doesn't really help with anything. It is still very warm, and that's more important than humidity when it comes to drying out. So the setup is perfect for very warm climates, sunny climates, or grow rooms, even dry climates actually, because everything is very humid and stays very humid around the orchid. So that's the optimal use. But then come the temperate climates where you have a very warm summer and a very cold winter. So this is where you will need to adjust a little bit. But then again, you kind of need to adjust with bark as well. So in a temperate climate, if you have the setup with Ceramis in winter time, you must keep in mind the quantity of water you are dosing to your orchids and try to keep it on the lower side rather than on the higher side. I know in summer you just poured water in the pot. No, it doesn't work that way in winter, and you're better off watering less than you should and just observe how the orchid goes and how everything dries. Start off with a little water, try to get the surface wet and then let the water do whatever it wants in the pot. Don't make it run in the tray, and see how the orchid lasts with the amount of water. If it's too little, you can increase it a little bit. It's always better to have too little water in the pot than too much, because it's harder to make it evaporate. Once the Ceramis is soaked, you're done. You're gonna have to wait it out. And this is valid for any orchid. In winter time, even if you're having a more moisture-loving orchid, it is better not to keep it in a pool of water, because that water will become very cold. And if you keep the pot more ventilated than very soggy, you will have a better balance of the temperature inside the pot. So things can be adjusted in temperate climates as well. So as for the optimal environment, warm, temperate, not so much cool. But maybe you can adjust cool as well. And by environment, I mean your grow space, not necessarily what's happening outside, but your own conditions in your grow space. So that's about it for today. This subject was actually requested by one of my viewers who was asking me what ratios I recommend for different orchids. It's hard for me to make a ratio for brassavolas or for miltonias and so on. It really is correlated to the type of pot, the size of the pot, the environment, and so on. As you can see, there are some tricks that you will start to have natively as well when you have more experience with Ceramis. And I hope I was coherent in what I said. Hope this was useful and hope you enjoyed it. If you did like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated this video, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye! Not long now and my beauty will be in full bloom. I really cannot wait. This is one of those orchids that absolutely puts a big smile on my face. And I know I said I would buy more bulbophyllums, but the experience that I had with the barbigerum made me a little iffy. But I will definitely order more bulbophyllums in the future.